Well, why don't we get started? We can go through those items that we don't necessarily. Mike can join us for the meat of this meeting, if you will. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting this Thursday, March 7th. We are talking today about, well, really one item, but before we jump into that, let's go to, have you all taken a look at the agenda? If you have, can I get a motion to approve it?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, Tessa, will you call roll, please?
Commissioner Sinclair,
Yes.
Commissioner Ostrander,
Yes.
Commissioner Matusik,
Yes.
Commissioner Bates, Commissioner Moritz,
Yes.
Chair Newton.
Yes. Okay, we'll move to public comment. Do we have anybody online here, Robert, besides
We
Steve?
have two attendees. We have Ms. Mirth Walker and a Sharon Clyde.
Okay, so we'll go through our public comment section. If you would like to speak, to make public comment at this time, we will allow you 3 minutes to make comment for consideration of the Planning Commission. We ask that public comment be related to items within our purview. Start by receiving recognition from me and state your full name and your mailing address. If you're speaking in a capacity representation of someone else and what capacity you are, and would be great. Is there anyone who'd like to make public comment at this time? No hands, Robert, am I?
No hands. I've got them both set up so they can talk.
Okay, great. Okay, so then we'll move on to our main item on the agenda today, continuation of ZO 2302, City of Cannon Beach request zoning ordinance text amendments. City of Cannon Beach request for zoning ordinance text amendments, chapter 17.43 wetland overlay zone. The zoning text amendment request will be reviewed against the criteria of the municipal code section 17.86070A amendments criteria and the statewide planning goals. The initial evidence you're hearing for this application took place on October 26, 2023. This is a continuation from our last Planning Commission meeting. Robert and Tessa, I don't have anything but what's online on the agenda. Is there anything else I should be adding to the introduction of this item? Or did I get it?
That's good.
I think you're good.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're dotting i's and crossing t's. Okay, so with that in mind, let's pick up the conversation where we left it off. Keith, as I remember our last conversation, you were going to incorporate the edits that Mirth Walker had presented us. I've seen those in the packet, and so let's start the conversation around any questions commission members had about what wasn't incorporated by Keith. Or Keith or Marcy, do you want to introduce this in any way, or do you want us just to start with questions?
Well, I think it might be helpful if I just give a very brief introduction to what
Sure.
I did.
Please do.
And you'll see a bullet list on the second page of the staff report right at the beginning of your package. Keep going up. There you go, that bullet list there. So the Planning Commission gave me direction basically on 6 general items to go back and amend the code. This translated into a few more bullets as to what I actually did. So one, generally speaking, I accepted Mirth Walker's comments and suggestions for improving the code. I also had some offline communication with Mirth, and she has taken a look at these amendments and seemed to be satisfied with those, but you'll get some testimony from her later, I assume. At Bill Kavaisman's recommendation, I omitted the references to reasonable use because he felt that was sort of open to a kind of an open-ended, potentially legal problem. This is one thing we didn't discuss, but I discovered it as I was going through this. We referred to LIDA, it's low impact development, in the definitions, but then we never used the term anywhere. So I in speaking with staff, we decided simply to delete that reference. At Bill Kabizman's recommendation, I moved table 17.43-1, which was just really talking about the process, what types of things go through either a administrative staff review or a planning commission review. It seemed to make a little more sense moving it up into the 040. We return to the averaging terminology that we use for wetland buffers, and amended the site alternatives analysis language slightly in the submittal requirements section in 060 E to coincide with the terminology used for the approval criteria in 070 C, and then also added a phrase or statement to make it clear that what's listed in 060 are not criteria. Those are just things you need to have in your application, essentially to be able to then address the criteria in 070. Then I clarified buffer averaging mitigation is required where insufficient upland areas is available to expand the buffer to compensate or average for the area. So essentially, if you don't have enough upland area on your property to do the buffer averaging, then you are required to do one-to-one mitigation for that amount of land that you can't compensate for, just area for area. And then also return to the protected wetlands terminology at Mirth Walker's suggestion. So that's it. And so you have a track changes version showing those changes from the last draft that you saw.
Thank you. Mirth, if you have any comments you'd like to make, I'm sure we're all more than welcome to hear it. And if you don't, that's okay. But again, from all of us, thank you for the effort that you put into your review and your continued effort between our last meeting and now. Really, really, really appreciate all you've done.
Thank you very much. I don't have any comments. I'm just here to observe the process. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for.
I actually have one comment on one of Mirth's suggested changes. So maybe, as you can guess, I have some other comments as well, but maybe we could start with that since Mirth is here and able to be a part of this question and conversation.
Great. Go ahead.
So I am looking at, let me find it so that I can tell you which page to scroll to, Robert. It's in the definitions. Okay, so on page 5 of the revised code, this is section 020E. There was a change made in the description of what happens when a buffer is impacted. I understand Mirth's point that it's broader to say impacted than filled because maybe a wetland has been impacted through vegetation, as she says, or some other reason. I'm a little bit concerned about saying that it is no longer buffer. Mirth, my understanding is that you were thinking about the specific instance in which you are performing buffer averaging and some portion of the buffer is now encroached upon, that should not be considered buffer. But I am really worried that this is a broad enough description here that if we say simply a buffer that is impacted is no longer buffer, that actually removes a lot of protections, because then someone can say, oh, well, this buffer is impacted because it was filled at some point, or this buffer has got vegetation on it. So it seems to me that for this broad definition, we want to keep that impacted buffers remain buffer.
Well, if they're filled, they're not going to be buffer anymore. So maybe that's the key here, is to not use the word impacted. I was approaching those terms based on how I deal with wetlands versus buffers, because wetlands are filled and buffers are encroached upon. So impact is a broader term that does bring in potential for confusion. I just think if you're taking a buffer away to do something with it, developmental wise, it's not going to be buffer anymore. So maybe we just need to clean up the language, and Keith probably has a magic solution for that.
Yeah, I do think that we just want to be careful that an argument can't be made that because the buffer has somehow been degraded, it's not buffer.
All right.
I think it's going to be pretty obvious that if it's encroached upon, it's already got a use on it. But I'm worried about the portions of the buffer that, for instance, aren't encroached upon, but were filled and under the previous code remained buffer. And I think that was something that was important to us, that even if you had filled the buffer area, it still was buffer. I'm just worried about us removing that part of the original code.
Well, I mean, if you look at what the definition of buffer is, it provides a buffer to the resource. And if you have a concrete retaining wall or a building, that's not providing any buffering function. So I think it does come down to whether it's a vegetated land or not.
So should we go back to the filled description? Would that in a way actually make it more protective?
I think so, but I will defer to Keith.
What if we say filled or developed?
I like
That doesn't, I'm worried that that doesn't really solve the issue because again, are we saying that it becomes buffer or does not? Because if it's just a piece of land that's been filled but hasn't been built on, hasn't been developed, it could still have some water filtration characteristics, etc. So in that case, my layman's understanding would be that we would want to continue to consider it buffer. But if there's a structure on it or something that's non-permeable, then yes, it's not operating as a buffer anymore.
Well, if it's been properly filled, it won't have any function. If it's been improperly filled, then it could still develop into a wetland again or buffer. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So I had a question about this. It's pretty clear the understanding of the protected wetlands legally filled in some, but in the first portion of this this paragraph here. But then buffer areas are, as Mirth mentioned, and as we were talking about, they're the buffer to the resource. So you wouldn't like fill, you would impact the buffer in some fashion by putting a structure in it or changing something about it, but it technically wouldn't get filled. So I feel like using the word filled kind of seems a little funky for the buffer to the resource. For the wetland itself, that terminology makes sense, but then I don't know if I feel like using impacted, but then using the terminology, leaving it to remain buffer area. It's buffer area that's been impacted, in my opinion. So it's I don't know if that's like a good legal route to go with that, but impacted to me makes sense. But then for it to remain a buffer in the legal sense, because it's been for whatever reason permitted or conditionally approved to do a thing, it's still technically the buffer area, even if it's not fulfilling the buffer duties. So if it changes in the future, then it's still the underlying area is still a buffer to that particular plot of area.
I'm afraid you might get into a loop there where you would continually have to get a permit to develop that buffer or impact that buffer or fill that buffer. So if we use the word developed, that might help clarify that if a buffer area is developed, it's no longer buffer. But maybe we don't need to go here.
No, I'm thinking Eric made a really good point about sort of a legal concept of a buffer versus a biological buffer. So legally, the city is defining a buffer area. Mirth, I think you're thinking of this as biologically it's no longer functioning, but from a legal boundary perspective, I think it makes sense to maintain that definition. I think our concern is that if we start saying, oh, if you fill the wetland, you no longer have buffer next to it, we are really motivating people to fill wetlands. So we're trying to be really consistent with these boundaries so that there's no benefit to filling a wetland and then suddenly you've got a whole lot more buildable land.
This is Keith. I think the key though is, from this day forward, they won't get legally filled because it would be a violation of the code. And, as we're having this discussion, I'm just thinking about non-conforming uses. So we're expanding this buffer by 45 feet. We're obviously going to be including some stuff that was legally built, impervious surface, homes, driveways, whatever. And if we include them in the buffer, and then they just want to make some improvements or do some things on this area that's already developed, now they could be trapped in some kind of a non-conforming use situation.
Yeah,
And then you're
that's the
trying
point.
I know, but if you try to apply the buffer stuff to something that's already been legally developed, I see that as being potentially problematic.
Yeah,
Well,
I
that's
agree.
why we included the pre-existing uses. But it is like other non-conforming uses in that if you change the use significantly, yes, you have to comply with the underlying code. And
Well,
I think our entire concern is that if we say, oh, that's no longer buffer, we really have not provided the same level of environmental protection as if there's a legal definition of a buffer boundary that is not changed by what the current use is.
yeah. Well, so how do you want to change this then? You want to go back to just filled?
This remains. I'm fine with impacted, but instead
Okay.
of saying that it is no longer, we would just say it remains just as the original version did.
But that doesn't make sense from implementing the rules on the ground with people. I mean, so one person impacts the buffer and then another person buys that property and he has to get a permit to impact that buffer again. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me how you're going to implement it.
So they would go through the non-conforming use code. So they can maintain a non-conforming use without needing a permit. But if they cease that non-conforming use and want to change it above a certain amount of change, then yes, they will need to conform with the new code, not prior code.
So then they would potentially have to pull some improvements out and what's the word I want? Restore it?
Only if they're making a major change. Obviously, they can maintain the current non-conforming use without a problem.
Right.
And without needing a permit.
Mhm.
So that we're not saying that they have to go undo something if it's currently being used the way that it was before this version of the code was implemented.
I think it's going to be really difficult to map if the city wants to map buffers on wetlands, then you're going to have symbology or coding for this is a buffer that's impacted but still buffer versus this buffer is gone. I just think it's going to be really hard to implement.
I don't think it's that complicated because we are mapping it from current wetlands. So we look at the current either local wetland inventory or as updated local wetland inventory, just as Robert has provided maps already showing what is the 50-foot buffer around existing wetlands. And that is the buffer that is mapped and that applies to new development.
And what if you already have a 12-foot wide road going through that 50-foot? Is that exempt from the buffer overlay?
So that's a pre-existing use. It's still in the buffer, but it is grandfathered in.
Yeah.
So it can be maintained, it's not a problem, but you can't put a new road or you can't widen it by another 12 feet without going through the permitting process, which is intended to make sure that we are carefully considering environmental impacts going forward.
Yeah.
And I actually think trying to map what the buffers are, if we do this approach, where we say the buffer that's impacted is not buffer, is going to be an unbelievable headache. I don't even know how the city would go about mapping that. So I think we have to have a really clear wetland-based buffer system that is not dependent on current use or future use.
Well, any new use of the site would provide that map of what buffer was being impacted on the site plan, so that would not be the burden on the city, because that's gonna
But
be.
we have an incredible amount of existing use, so I don't know how to be fair. Why would the new uses get to exempt themselves from the buffer, whereas the old uses are just going to be a non-conforming use within a buffer?
Quick, just to make sure, we're all centered up on, language here. Mickey, are you saying you're okay with impacted staying, but over, 4 words over, keep, remain, delete, are no longer? So it would read,
Yes,
wetland buffer areas that are legally impacted under this chapter remain wetland buffer areas. Les, Aaron, Mike, Eric, thoughts? How do you guys feel about that?
So I have another question back about it again. So this to remain buffer areas is for all intents and purposes the overall mapping of the area, correct? Of the actual wetland itself. So we hypothetically you go to the city GIS map online, and if it were to go with the verbiage to remain wetland buffer, then it'll be measured essentially from the edge of the wetlands 50 feet out all the way around the wetlands. If we were to delete that and say are no longer wetland buffer areas, then it would be updating to the GIS maps to kind of go a little wonky around each of the existing uses that have impacted the buffers. Is that how I'm under?
I think that's what
I'm
the
understanding it?
consequence would be, yeah. I'm just picturing the administration of that being incredibly complicated.
Yes.
So from an administrative point of view, for Steve and Robert, leaving it as the wetland buffer legally impacted would remain buffer area. That is the more simple administrative portion, or the administrative decision.
Probably, what do you think?
Yeah, it'd be probably, yeah, I'm just, yeah. It's gonna be challenging with our mapping and just keeping up to date and things like that. So yeah, yes, it would, but
Yeah, one of the things we're gonna have to do is we're going to have to figure out how to take the paper maps that we have and incorporate those into a GIS layer and have that all kind of accurately represented. I'm not 100% sure what form that's gonna look like. I know that going forward, we've been asking when we receive any of these DSL concurrence letters from an applicant, we've been also reaching out and asking for updated GIS layers. We've got a couple of those for a couple properties, the Forest Lawn property being one of them. I believe there's another one I got some information for as well. And so that can be brought into a map. I'm not 100% sure what that's going to look like, if it's going to be treated as sort of an overlay on the existing, the 1993 LWI, or, what form that would take. I don't know if I want to go through and excise out little chunks of the blob, if you will, because they show up as blobs on the old LWI map. So I don't know what that's going to be. It might just simply be an overlaid layer showing the updated information. But that's something we're going to be having to figure out how to represent that going forward.
And keep in mind as well that when you have a buffer averaging situation, you will need to show the additional buffer that's greater than 50 feet in areas where it was taken away before. So my experience with buffer average comes mainly from Clean Water Services. And once they have shown that a buffer is gone, it's gone. It's not considered buffer anymore. And it's much more easily administered that way legally from a fairness to all standpoint. But I understand where you're coming from. And if you want to keep it that way, that's your decisions.
Correct, and that's a very good point, bringing up the buffer averaging, because that's something that through an application process, we would have to have some kind of an electronic layer provided to us that we can map out and thereby track these kind of averaged buffer changes going forward. So that way it isn't something that it's on a piece of paper, it goes into a folder, into a drawer, and then it gets forgotten about.
Yeah, and I think maybe that makes sense to include somewhere in the requirements in 050 that a shapefile be provided for the adjusted buffer when buffer averaging is applied.
There is a provision at the
I thought I
very
saw
end
that.
of the, yeah, at the very end of this chapter, there's a new section that says you have to provide a GIS file to the staff.
And is that broad enough to capture the buffer averaging? So I know that when we originally talked about that, that was specific to the delineation. So I just want to make sure that it doesn't look like it's a shapefile only for the original delineation, but that it includes any adjustments after approval.
Here's what we have. This is in 070M. This is a new section. Mapping delineated wetlands and wetland buffers as a condition of approval, the applicant shall provide digital GIS mapping data of the accepted wetland delineation or resulting change in the boundary of a protected wetland and wetland buffer to the city manager for the purpose of updating the city's LWI map file.
That should cover it
So,
then.
yeah, I think
Okay.
so. I think
Okay,
that's
great.
because that's after you got your approval, you give us the
Okay.
final stuff. Yeah.
Perfect. I have some other comments, but I'll let others go first if they'd like.
Before we move on from this, just to make sure we're wrapping it up, fellow commissioners, you okay with that language that Mickey is asking that we incorporate there?
Yeah, Clay, this is Les. Once a buffer, always a buffer does feel like the most straightforward way to consider it. I do think there's some wrinkles though. I happen to live on a lot that will be now within buffer when it wasn't before, and I'm not the only one, I'm sure. So I have some reservations, but I don't see how you can do it otherwise unless we want to employ a full-time GIS expert to keep track of all the bits and pieces. And I don't think that's really in the cards. So I'm okay with Mickey's language.
And as well, for that reason.
So to
Okay.
confirm then, we are saying it will be legally, that are legally impacted, keep that under this chapter, but then say remain as wetland buffer areas as opposed to are no longer. So that's the change, right?
That's
Right.
correct.
Okay, all right.
Okay, Mickey. You still got the
All
gavel.
right. So let's see, page 8, which is, let me find, is 060E, the site alternatives analysis, number 2. Related to buffer averaging, I would delete to the extent upland area is available. I think, Keith, when we talked about coming back to the averaging language, as I said in the last meeting, we also want to be super clear that if buffer averaging is being applied, it is because there's sufficient upland to devote to converted buffer, not just partial, but complete compensation for encroachment. The idea, again, as I said last time, being that buffer averaging in the way that we are using it and in the way I've seen it used elsewhere is self-compensating. It doesn't require averaging plus a mitigation plan. It's the quick approach for small encroachments. So
Right.
when we say to the extent upland area is available, it makes it sound as though you could partially apply averaging. And then we have an applicant who says, well, I averaged, and we say, no, actually, you're gonna average, plus you're gonna come back with a mitigation plan for the rest. So it seems a lot cleaner to me to say that if you happen to have a parcel where it works to completely compensate for the encroachment on that parcel plus an added area from upland on that same parcel, you get to avoid creating a mitigation plan. If you can't do that, you don't do it partially and move on. You just say, well, I move on and maybe that's
Okay.
part of a future mitigation plan. So I would remove to the extent upland area is available and instead say the analysis shall include, just as you do, expanded by an equivalent area of upland to compensate.
Okay.
And so then that relates, I have two other comments, but that relates to one of my other comments, which is over on page 14, which is the approval criteria.
Mickey, can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions from people, or should we move on? Okay, Mickey, you still got it.
Seems straightforward.
So this is, again, the exact same issue that we just discussed, but this is over in the approval criteria, which again addresses averaging. So on page 13, in fact, Robert, if you don't mind going back to C2. We would need to add some language in the paragraph that says then minor wetland buffer encroachment, that paragraph there. I would add then minor wetland buffer encroachment and compensation with expanded buffer area shall next be considered. And I'm happy to type these up and send them later as well, but let's put them out there
Okay.
verbally to discuss them first.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I lost you a little bit exactly where you were,
Yeah.
but I understand what you're saying.
Right, and so then over on page 14, which is 2F. Again, we would just remove the to the extent upland area is available. When you're ready, I have one final comment.
Say, Mickey, this is Les, that the statement that's been added in blue on that page 14 would be 2F, where it ends the statement, if sufficient upland area is not available on the subject property, the application shall satisfy the requirements of section C3, which is the one that follows. That would be good language for your comments.
Yes,
Before, wouldn't it? To me, it
Definitely.
it feels like it indicates the flow a little better than what I think we were talking about.
yes, I really do appreciate that added language.
So are you suggesting that language in the first section, back on page,
8, I think.
the last, yeah, 8?
That-
That language just copied up there again.
That's what I was thinking.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's great to be clear.
Can you just clarify where that sentence gets added in additionally? Gets added in also? On step 2?
Yes, so it's step 2, which is E2.
Yes,
Right.
in 060, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just adding it just as the last sentence of that paragraph for step 2.
Mickey, did you have another one or was that the?
And this is a little bit more complex, but I think very, very important before we pass this on to council. So I am looking at page 12, which is wetland lot of record. That is 070B. So as you all recall, at our last meeting, we were talking about this, using the term reasonable use and why that could be a little bit complicated legally. So we were trying to avoid that. I appreciate, Keith, the idea of using a different term, but I am really worried still about us making a statement in the code that the use of the wetland lot of record, which of course, if we're not careful, people will interpret to mean upland areas, not just the wetland or wetland buffer, and to say that they're limited to a maximum coverage of 1,000 square feet. That is not true, because if there is sufficient upland, they could build whatever the FAR allows them to do on their property. So I really want to be clear so that we don't end up with a lot of really upset people thinking that we're telling them that even if they have upland sufficient for more than 1,000 square feet, they can't do that. So one way to approach this would be to do what Amanda Punton somewhat endorsed, as you recall, Keith, when she said that clear and objective can be no. So one could be basically a statement that development within the protected wetland and its buffer area is prohibited, although development within the upland is permitted under code sections, referring to the standard development process. And then we move into the hardship provisions. So I feel like we need to make that first statement just cleanly not in wetland or wetland buffer. Don't even refer yet to what the hardship would allow. And then we move into hardship and say, if you can't make use, here's what we can permit under a hardship provision.
Okay.
So I'm picturing one is a general statement like that. And then maybe further down, I think that the hardship language you have later in that section works fine, but I just want us to not make a statement up front about limited use, because I think it's misleading. And I think it's going to make it really tough for Robert and Steve to try to explain to folks.
I've been kind of toying with this particular thing for a while, and I may not have brought it up before. I thought I did. What we're really defining is the minimum criteria for development on, well, in this case, a wetland lot of record, but it's a definition. I mean, we're basically saying that you are guaranteed to be able to build at least 1,000 square foot plus 400 square feet on any given lot. And I wonder if that definition shouldn't be in the definitions more than buried in this section.
We did talk about that. It's what to call it. So, and how to define it in a way that doesn't sound limiting, but instead sounds like you're allowing. So it's very, very easy to get the impression when you try to create a definition like that, that's somehow limiting what can happen on the upland. And I feel like we haven't yet landed in a place where we can explain that clearly enough that it doesn't sound like the entire lot is limited. And that's what I'm stuck with.
So in that statement, permissible use of a wetland lot of record is defined as a maximum building coverage. Is that really not a minimum building coverage?
Well, the problem is what you're calling wetland lot of record. So if you go back to our definition, the wetland lot of record is the parcel that contains wetland or wetland buffer. What we're really defining is development within buffer and wetlands, not development of the upland. So when we use this term wetland lot of record, it can be I think a little bit misleading because of the fact that the wetland lot of record also includes upland. And although there's a part of the code that says all of these limitations only apply to the buffer and the buffer area, when you use this term wetland lot of record, it's very easy to think that also applies to the upland. And I think if you sit down and you really carefully read the code, you realize that's not true, but most people are not going to be able to follow that. So I do not want to create any confusion unnecessarily.
Right.
I'm confused.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think let's not apply, let's not say,
Okay,
let's not try to define, let's just say you can't build in the buffer or the wetland areas of the wetland lot of record, but that you can permit, you are permitted to develop the upland area in accordance with standard, development procedures under, I can't name the sections because I don't have them on the top of my head.
Right.
So maybe it makes it clear for folks that if there are limitations, it's going to occur on the buffer portion, not the upland portion. And then we can say, if you have a hardship and you don't have upland area, then you get to go through the process under the hardship provisions to ensure that you have at least 1,000 square foot footprint.
So we're really just rewriting number 1 to describe what the boundaries are.
Yes. I think that actually
So we've defined what a lot of record is in the definitions, and then this is just saying what you can do in the wetland lot of record as we defined it up above.
Yes.
So you're okay with the rest of this 2 and 3 below, right? The way that's worded, it's just.
I'm just wondering if we have to say, so it says currently the uses and development subject to the use provisions in section B1. So obviously that's going to become, it actually might still be true, wouldn't it? Because we would say the use provisions in section B1 are, you can't develop in the buffer and wetland, but you can develop your upland. So I think that still works.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so then I think from there, the language flows.
Yeah.
And I think I might actually be done with my comments.
Good stuff, Mickey.
Yeah, thank you.
I just need one clarification. Sorry. What is changing in the sentence after number 1?
That's getting reworked completely.
Okay. Does Keith,
So
you have
that's,
Yeah, well, my understanding is I think what we're doing is I'm going to craft something new for section number 1 that makes it clear that we're not limiting the upland area to 1,400 square feet. I mean, if you have 2,000 square feet available, you can use it if it's upland. You just, and then just saying that, but if you don't have that, you're guaranteed this minimum. And then just make sure all of that fits and flows with 2 and 3 below as I wind up writing it.
have we clearly stated anywhere, Amanda Punton's clear and objective standard, that development is not permitted within buffer or wetlands? That would be our clear and objective standard, and this is the place to put it.
Yeah.
So
This
that
is
has to be here too.
Yeah. And then that would coincide with the site analysis that you have to provide in your application. Then it would also coincide with the criteria in C that follow.
Right. So this will be our clear and objective no. We're not telling you no on the upland. There are hardship provisions below.
Right.
And I don't even know at this point whether you have to get into the 1,000 square feet and 400 square feet, because that's outlined in the hardship provisions. But either way, I think we need our clear and objective no, and upland is still developable as standard.
Right.
What should be the process for rewriting this section and getting it approved for, going on to city council? This was going to be our last meeting, but it sounds like we need to give Keith some time to craft this language here and make sure that it's acceptable.
The thought might be is if, and this is just something to think about from a plan commission perspective, is if we wanted this stuff rewritten again. We have a meeting coming up on the 28th of this month. It's possible that if you wanted, we could include this on the agenda, on that particular agenda if you would like. Just something to think about. That way it gives Keith time to redraft it, and then you might have the opportunity to review it one more time before making a formal recommendation if you chose to do it that way.
Keith, how long do you think, putting the timing that Steve just outlined, how long do you need to make the changes? Seems like there's, the number one is.
It better not take me more than a half hour. I have to scratch
Exactly.
my head for 15 minutes and then I'll write for the next 15. And I think that's all it's going to take. Yeah.
Okay. Well, do people want to wait for our next meeting, or do we want to meet again like this? Sounds like probably a little more shortly, or in a little more brevity, but I'm open to either. What do other people think?
I wouldn't mind getting this done myself. Just another really brief meeting. I think at this point, we've had an opportunity now to review the major changes. So I think there's very little left really to address.
Sure. You want to meet early next week?
Sure.
Like this? Okay. How do other people feel?
I can try to make it. Monday and Tuesday are going to be difficult, but I will do my best to make it during those days.
I'm guessing, Keith, check me if you think I'm off here. I'm gonna knock on wood. This is a 20-minute call, Zoom call for us to get through what we talked about here. Just having it in there and.
Yeah.
So I think if there's a window, Mike, in terms of time, that Monday or Tuesday, or we could punt to Wednesday.
No, why don't you guys do it when it works on Monday or Tuesday? Let's get through it, as Mickey said. And I might be traveling as all, so I'll just call in when it's time.
Sure. Okay. People have their calendars out?
Yep.
Let's do it.
In terms of scheduling the room, Robert and Steve, do we have a limit on when the city Zoom is available?
We're bringing that up now. Okay, this might take a second.
While he's bringing that up, I had two comments or two questions. One of them's fairly quick. The other one's probably just going to be something to be explained to me. But the page 1 in the definitions, where it's we've added in it's been added in the invasive species for Oregon Department of Agriculture. Is there a real necessity, or is it a concern to have the actual URL for that in there? Should we remove that because we don't know for sure it's going to be that much of a permalink?
Yeah,
Having a reference to where it can be found, sure, but having the actual URL kind of seemed a little possibly short-sighted if they make adjustments to that.
Afternoon.
Good catch.
That's the top. We could go for one.
The other question I had was in reference to the public comment that we received last night, about where did my email go? From Graves, in reference to the contiguous ownership, and I had a question about what that meant. It's in our existing code right now, about contiguous ownership lots, and it has a short definition about that. But I wanted to address what her concerns were with what that means when you own multiple separate lots that are. Is it contiguous? I didn't really understand how this affects a case like this.
I could respond to that if you'd like. So Robert and I will be meeting with Mrs. Graves. We've talked to her a couple times throughout this process. She's got a couple of lots that are undeveloped, and she might be looking to sell or build or what have you. And she wanted to do some lot line adjustments and some different things involved in that. And I have a feeling that at such time as the wetlands ordinance would be adopted, that it would impact her plans in terms of doing a lot line adjustment to try to create 2 lots, because I think if I'm not mistaken, that you want to keep all of the wetlands of record on one of the lots, and how she would rearrange it would put it on 2 lots, or would put it, instead of all of it being on 1 lot, it would split it onto 2 lots. So she will be impacted once this happens, and right now she could do some things, but these are conversations that are somewhat challenging to have to explain without a formal development and approvals and things like that. But we continue to meet with her to continue to talk about where we're at and what she's thinking.
Okay, yeah, I just when I was reading the new code, that's the new verbiage that we have, and then the old verbiage, there's still a lot of similarities in terms of references to the contiguous property and definitions of what the contiguous lots are. I just didn't with her description that she had in her comment here, I wasn't exactly sure how this, not I imagine there's probably other cases similar-ish to this, that owning multiple lots and wanting to having a concern about being able to develop other ones with contiguous ownership, what that really meant. And I was just unclear about what the contiguous ownership or contiguous lots meant in terms of developability of each individual lot.
Well, I think it's one of the things she stated in her letter was she wanted to be on the record of making her concern known. There are going to be some pieces of what we're moving forward that are not going to work for everybody. And I think it's pretty important that this letter and her testimony, City Council consider when they look at whether or not they want to adopt this. I think, we've done as good a job as we can to try to be fair, but there are going to be exceptions, and she's pointed to what she believes is one. And so I'm glad this is in here. I think we should probably have
Somebody else has a meeting.
let City Council make the decision as to whether or not they want to revise something based on her testimony and that of others. That's my takeaway. I don't know how others feel.
No, that was my same sense.
Anything else before we get to schedules? And
I had a general question, and I may just be worrying needlessly. I was thinking about clear and objective standards and how to identify those. And I usually associate those with those vague words like minimize or some kind of things like that. And we still got some language like that in our proposed code. There's an example on page 16 where it says routes for new utility corridors shall be selected to minimize adverse impacts on the wetland and to minimize vegetation removal. And I wondered, just as part of the group, is that sufficiently vague to cause problems, or can we live with that?
Well, remember the clear and objective applies to housing. So,
Well, yeah, but I mean,
there's a minor argument that utilities are necessary to get to housing, but it's not like, hey, you can't build a house here because it's not minimizing something or other. And that is the reason why we just had this conversation about what is the clear and objective housing standard in buffers and wetlands. And we do have confirmation from DLCD that they consider the clear and objective standard. Once you have set out a clear and objective standard, you can have, let's call them fuzzy standards, as an alternative pathway. So that's why if there are less than clear and objective standards, even though that would still be best practices, let's set that out there. But even if in the rest of the code related to housing, not everything is clear and objective, because we've given one clear and objective pathway, that second pathway doesn't have to be as rigorous.
And to build on that, there's also a distinction between utilities versus utility corridors, because the utility connecting your house to a utility corridor is very different from the corridor itself, which is, say, a mile or 5 miles of piping or electrical lines or something like that, which is not under housing and would be installed either by the city or by some larger corporate entity rather than an individual developer.
Good to know. I had one more quick question, and this is about the revised maps, Robert, that you provided us. I wasn't aware that we recognize significant versus non-significant inventoried wetlands in our mapping. But that's the heading on the maps that you put out, and I was trying to understand that.
So I think Marcy will be better set up to answer that question.
Yep.
Okay.
So the direction that we got from Amanda Punton was that wetlands that were not identified as significant in the 1993 Fishman wetland inventory cannot be regulated in this way. And so the wetlands that are mapped as not significant on Robert's mapping are those, I think it's 6 properties or 6 areas that are not, they did not rise to the level of significance in the 1993 wetland inventory. I think that's the most simple explanation. Keith, did I miss anything?
No, you didn't. The other thing is that 93 study also looked at riparian corridors and streams, and those, of course, are removed for the purpose of administering this chapter, which is only applying to wetlands.
Now, one thing to add on to that is that at least 2 of the sites, site 8 and site, I believe, 51, they're both relatively small wetland parcel sites down toward the south end of town. Those are both contiguous with riparian areas as well. So site 8 is paired up with site 9, which is a stream corridor. I believe site 51 is both a wetland and a stream corridor. So there could be some overlap between the 2 provisions as far as wetland versus stream code that applies to those 2 particular sites.
That helpful, Les?
Well, it is helpful, and I don't want to delay it. I thought I understood the 93 study to have not found any significant wetlands within Cannon Beach, and I was surprised I was that incorrect.
Most of the sites are classified as significant. There were just a handful that are classified as non-significant. I think when we get into the conversation about stream corridors, there may be more that are going to be identified through that. But as far as wetland sites, there were 6 that are identified as non-significant.
I will say that it is confusing to read that report at first, because the table seems to indicate that they're not significant, but the text preceding explaining how the table organizes the information tells you that I think it's medium, things that are classified as medium and the other higher up category are all considered significant or something like that. It's you do have to read it a couple of times.
Thank you for that clarification. Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? All right, let's look at our calendars and see what next week looks like to have a short meeting to get these last little details covered.
I think we only got one time on Monday or Tuesday, correct?
Well, in order to meet the notice requirements, we'd probably prefer Tuesday. Or possibly Tuesday at 11 or Tuesday at 1.
Either one's fine with me.
Yeah, they both work equally for me.
I have for what it's worth, I have a conflict at 11, but I don't know if these changes are going to be that significant. I'm available at 1.
It would be great for you to be here, I think, just in case.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't we shoot, does 1 o'clock work for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, and a 1 o'clock meeting would have to be short. This room is booked for a 2 o'clock meeting, so as long as it doesn't exceed half an hour, that should be fine.
Okay.
Okay.
This group, come on, why would we? That sounds great, I love it, we got a block on us.
It's good to limit us.
11:30 at night for one of these meetings, will you? Someone coming in the office. Okay, 1 PM, Tuesday the 12th.
1 to 1:30.
1 to 1.
That end time is critical.
Okay,
Thank you again, Keith and Marcy, for your patience with this process. I know it's got to be
Oh.
painful.
Likewise, thank you for yours.
I think with that,
All right.
we'll continue our meeting to next Tuesday and adjourn there. Thank you, everyone.
Hey,
Okay.
thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.